Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Ross Lightman, other members of this distinguished committee. I'm pleased to be here to represent the outstanding work that our staff has done in connection with Iraq. This is my third hearing on Iraq. I've got another one, at least one more this week, and some member briefings as well. I think it's important to note several things at the outset. That we are reporting as required by law on the status of whether or not the Iraqi government has met its commitments with regard to 18 benchmarks. We were required by law to do this. We were required by law to report by September 1, so we didn't pick it at a particular opportune time. We're doing what we were asked to do. Secondly, it's important to note that we were asked to note whether or not the status was met or not met on each of these 18 benchmarks. However, GAO must use its independent professional judgment, and in doing so, we also want to try to be fair and balanced. And therefore, I decided that it would not have been fair and balanced just to use a met or not met criteria, and we used our independent professional judgment to decide in certain circumstances it was appropriate to show partially met. Furthermore, I think it's important for you to understand that just because something is not met doesn't mean there hasn't been any progress. Furthermore, one needs to understand that it is my understanding that the Congress intended for this to be the first of what is likely to be recurring reports by the GAO, so this would establish a baseline from which one would be able to establish progress or lack thereof going forward. And finally, it's important to understand that we provided a lot of commentary in order to try to add contextual sophistication with regard to where things are in connection with these 18 items. I want to say at the outset that irrespective of what we're saying that the current status is as of August 30th, 2007, that this should in no way, shape, or form detract from the courageous efforts of our military and those of our coalition partners. My son fought in Iraq as a Marine Corps officer, and believe me, we all want to win. The question is, how do you define winning, and what's the best way to win? And I think we need to revisit both of those key questions at this point in time. Now, we, in conducting this work, interviewed officials from the Department of Defense, State, Treasury, Multinational Force Iraq, Defense Intelligence Agency, Central Intelligence Agency, National Intelligence Council, the United Nations, a variety of parties, including Ambassador Crocker and including General Petraeus. And let me say, I believe that you need to seriously consider this report because it is a professional and independent report. At the same point in time, I will also say I think you need to seriously consider what you hear from Ambassador Crocker and General Petraeus and what you hear from former General Jones and others, and you need to consider all that information in order to decide what Mr. Poe said, which I think is the right question. What's the best way forward? Where do we go from here? In doing that, let me show on the first graphic, chart number 1 is on page 4 of my testimony. This is the source of the 18 benchmarks. This is not something Congress came up with. The basic source of these benchmarks are commitments that have been made by the Iraqi government dating back to June of 2006. The next graphic shows what our bottom line assessment is on the 18 benchmarks. First, not all benchmarks are equal. We did not attempt, however, to substitute our judgment for that of the Congress or the administration or anything else to say which ones are the most important, but I think it's important to note not all benchmarks are equal. Secondly, I think it's important to note that of these, there are 3 categories: legislative, security, and economic. Of the legislative, 1 was met, 1 was partially met, and 6 were not met. Of the security, 2 were met, 2 were partially met, and 5 were not met. And of the economic, 1 was partially met. And again, as I said, if it's not met, doesn't mean there's been no progress. It just means there hasn't been enough progress to be able to give recognition to at least partially met. Let me also note in that regard that we have in our report our methodology, which is clearly defined, consistently applied, well documented, and transparent, is on what basis do we decide that something is not met, partially met, or met. Now, I would respectfully suggest that you need to be asking some questions on that when other people report, is what's their methodology? What's the basis? How do they reach that? Candidly, we were asked to do something fundamentally different than what the President was asked to do. The President was asked to note whether or not progress is being made. Whether or not progress is being made is fundamentally different than where things stand as of a point in time. It's also inherently more subjective. Whether or not progress is being made is inherently more subjective. Look at the President's management agenda, which I commend. It has 2 ratings, at least twice a year. Where do things stand at that point in time, and what type of progress is being made? I would respectfully suggest you got to consider both. You ought to consider both. Now, the next graphic will end up showing the legislative factors, the legislative benchmarks, in particular with regard to debathification, the hydrocarbon laws, the laws with regard to the regions, elections, amnesty, disarmament, and demobilization. And you can see here that in many cases, as is in the case of the hydrocarbon law and elections, there are a number of things that have to get done. It's not just one piece of legislation. There are multiple pieces of legislation and or implementation actions that have to take place. And therefore, when you consider the full picture, I think you might have a better understanding as to how we reached the judgments that we reached. Next, please. If you look on the security front, you'll see that these are the trends in overall average daily attacks from June of 2003 to July of 2007. Now, these are average daily attacks. These are not lethality. This is what type of activity is occurring, and obviously February only has 28 months. July has 28 days. July has, sorry about that, it's been a long day, 28 days, sometimes 29 on leap years, and July has 31. And so I think in fairness you need to use average daily rather than going by monthly. And what you'll see based on this public information, non-classified, is that attacks had gone up pretty consistently until July, where they went down. And in July, we had roughly the same level of attacks that we did in February of 2007. Now, we're aware of information through August 15th. We asked for information through the end of August. It was not provided to us, but I'm hope and expect that you'll hear something on that, when General Petraeus, comes before you, and I think you need to consider that. But we also need to keep in mind that this month is Ramadan. And historically, there has been an abatement of violence the month before Ramadan and an increase in violence during Ramadan. Now, let's hope that that won't be continued. Let's hope that we'll see an exception here. With regard to Al-Anbar province, there's absolutely no question that there has been a dramatic change in Al-Anbar province. There's absolutely no question that there are several reasons for that. One of which is that the tribal leaders decided that Al-Qaeda had gone too far, and they decided that the enemy of their enemy is their friend, and therefore they have allied with us. And there has been a tremendous change. Now the question is that sustainable? Is that transferable? Al-Anbar province is not Baghdad. The surge was supposed to be primarily about Baghdad. So it's not that that's not relevant, it's just not relevant necessarily to the benchmarks, which are about Baghdad and political and economic progress, if you will. There's also been some progress in Baghdad with regard to the surge. There's no question about that. And there's frankly been more progress on the security front with regard to what we've done, not for what the Iraqis have done, but what we've done than there has been on the political front, and clearly the biggest gap is the political front. But one must keep in mind what was the purpose of the surge. The purpose of the surge was to provide breathing room such that political progress could be made. That's the stated purpose of the surge. So far, we haven't seen that political progress. Hopefully that will change. Hopefully that will change. But that was the stated purpose of the surge. Next graphic will show that if you look at our assessment as of August 30th, 2007 versus the administration's preliminary assessment as of July 2007. Now again, they were assessing progress which is fundamentally different than status. But if you look at that, you'll see that there's one area where there's a significant difference, where we said not met and they said, they said satisfactory progress, and that was on the first one. But the rest of them, either we agreed or there was a one difference in rating rather than a two difference in rating. Now, I would expect that the ratings that you're going to hear next week are going to probably improve on some of these, but I don't know that for a fact, and we'll wait and see. In conclusion, as of August 30th, 2007, the Iraqi government had met 3, partially met 4, and not met 11 of 18 legislative, security, and economic benchmarks. I think it's important to note that in late August, Iraq's senior Shia, Sunni Arab, and Kurdish political leaders signed a unity accord, signaling efforts to foster greater national reconciliation. The accord covered draft legislation on depacification reform and provincial powers laws, as well as setting up a mechanism to release some Sunni detainees being held without charges. However, while this conceptual agreement has been reached, we haven't seen progress with regard to the other benchmarks necessary to improve the rating, and hopefully we will see that progress by the next time we report, but only time will tell. As Congress considers the way forward, as Mr. Poe said, it's not where we've been, where we are, is where we should go from here. As you consider the way forward, I think you clearly should consider our report. You clearly should consider these 18 benchmarks, but you also should consider the report of others, and you should consider factors that are beyond these 18 benchmarks. These aren't the 18 benchmarks I would write if you asked us to write 18 benchmarks. They're important. They're important. You ought to consider them. But I think there are other things that are important, too, that aren't contained in these 18 benchmarks. And I think it's also important to note that we made 3 recommendations which the administration agreed with in our report with regard to providing additional information to Congress on these benchmarks, more information on the nature of violence, quantitative and qualitatively, and also more information on the loyalty of Iraqi security forces. It's not just whether or not you have enough. It's not just whether or not they're ready. It's whether they're loyal. And by loyalty, what I mean by that is, will you discharge your responsibilities in a neutral, non-sectarian fashion? Will you execute your military duties and responsibilities in a neutral and non-sectarian fashion? We don't have that problem in our country. Other parts of the world, they do have that problem. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to answer any questions the members may have.